Wedged in the roots of an ordinary tree on a Minnesota farm sat a 500-year-old message built to detonate one of history's boldest claims. Columbus discovering America is the story everyone learned. This rock claims that story is 130 years too late. Within weeks, linguists called it fraud, and the Smithsonian spent decades flip-flopping on it. Olaf Oman, the farmer who found it, refused money, used it as a doorstep, and died insisting it was real. That was 1898, outside Kensington, Minnesota. Decades later, a modern scientist tested it again, and the result should not have been possible. That knoll was on his own property, being cleared of stumps that autumn to make room for crops. The stone lay face down in the dirt, wrapped in the roots of a stunted poplar tree. It was his son Edward, 10 years old, who noticed the markings first. Strange, angular symbols, cut in careful rows across the stone's face. Oman guessed it might be some kind of Indian almanac. He had no idea what he was actually holding. Even the discovery date isn't fully settled. Some early accounts place it in August. Others say November. No outsider ever laid eyes on the tree itself. Still rooted, still growing. By the time anyone from outside the farm arrived, all that remained was a stump, a hole, and a story. That gap, months of silence before a single independent witness saw the site intact, is the kind of detail investigators circle back to again and again. What Oman was holding, if genuine, was a message from a Norse expedition that had pushed deep into the North American interior a century before any European was supposed to be within 1,000 miles of Minnesota. The inscription, written in a mix of runes and Latin numerals, described 8 Goths, Scandinavians, possibly from Gotaland or Gotland, and 22 Norwegians on a journey west from Vinland. It described a camp by 2 skerries, a fishing trip, and a return to find 10 men red with blood and dead. It ended with a prayer, AVM, Ave Maria, save us from evil, and a note about 10 more men left behind to guard the ships. 14 days' travel from the stone. The numbers themselves were carved in an old dot and line counting system, which only made the whole thing feel more convincingly ancient. If that story was true, it would rewrite the discovery of America. Word spread fast. A neighbor, Nils Flatten, came to see it the same day and later swore to the discovery under oath. The stone was hauled into town, propped up in a bank window, copied by hand, and mailed off to scholars at the University of Minnesota. And this is where the first crack appeared, almost immediately. Professor Olaus Breda examined the copied inscription and published his verdict within weeks in the university's own student paper. The grammar was wrong, not slightly wrong. Wrong in a way that suggested someone writing in modern Scandinavian languages, not medieval ones. He forwarded copies to leading scholars across Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The response was unanimous: fraud. A modern forgery dressed up as a 14th century relic. By early 1899, the case looked closed. Except nobody actually closed it. The stone went back to Oman's farm. And what happened next should have ended the debate for good, one way or another. Instead, it made everything stranger. Oman didn't display it as a treasure. He didn't sell it, though people offered. He used it face down as a stepping stone by his granary door. For years, farm equipment rolled over it. Boots scraped across the carved surface every morning. If he'd spent months faking a historical bombshell, he was treating it like garbage. That detail alone should tell you something is off in this story. But it cuts both ways, and that's the trap. A hoaxer hiding a stone in plain sight, using it as a doorstep, is either supreme confidence or supreme indifference to something he genuinely didn't understand the value of. To understand what really happened, you have to look at who Olaf Oman actually was. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a Swedish immigrant with an ordinary rural education, in a time and place where runes were still taught in country schools back home. He owned books, real ones, sitting on a real shelf that historians later cataloged, a popular Swedish schoolmaster's manual with a chapter on the history of the language, A History of Sweden by the scholar Oscar Montelius, and inside one of them, a medieval prayer that ended almost word for word like the phrase carved into the stone. He also had a friend, Sven Fogelblad, a defrocked pastor and itinerant schoolmaster who owned an old Swedish grammar book, reportedly knew runes, and reportedly resented the university men who looked down on immigrant farmers like him and Oman. Motive, opportunity, materials. It's not proof. Nobody ever confessed. But it's the kind of coincidence that makes investigators uneasy, and it should make you uneasy too. Then there's the tree. Investigators in 1910 tried to use it as a natural clock to count the rings and estimate how long the stone had been buried beneath the roots. Except witnesses gave wildly different numbers. Some said the tree looked 10 or 12 years old. Others insisted on 30 or 40. Nobody had actually examined the tree itself while it stood. Only a stump and a hole were inspected months later, after the site had already been disturbed. A detail meant to settle the mystery only deepened it. And decades after that, when the Smithsonian Institution put the stone on public display in 1948, newspapers ran headlines calling it one of the most important archaeological finds in North America. It looked like vindication. It wasn't. The endorsement came from a single Smithsonian official giving a personal opinion, not a formal institutional ruling. 7 years later, the museum quietly aligned itself with a Danish scholar's conclusion that the inscription simply wasn't medieval at all. The prestige had been borrowed. Nobody advertised giving it back. So by the middle of the 20th century, the runestone was sitting in a strange kind of limbo, rejected by the scholars who studied its language, semi-celebrated by the public who wanted it to be real. And that's where the story might have stayed, a quiet regional oddity, if not for a rock. The stone kept traveling anyway. It stood on display at the 1965 New York World's Fair, in front of crowds who had never heard of Kensington, Minnesota. Decades later, it made the reverse journey, shipped back across the Atlantic for exhibitions in Stockholm and in Hudiksvall, in the very region of Sweden Oman's family had come from. A 202-pound slab of carved gray stone born as a farm doorstep, ending up under museum spotlights on 2 continents. Wherever it went, the crowds came to look. The scholars kept saying the same thing. Nobody stopped looking. In 1910, the Minnesota Historical Society ran its own investigation, pulling in outside experts to settle things once and for all. Linguist George Flom went through the inscription line by line and confirmed what the European scholars had already said. The grammar belonged to the modern era, not the 14th century. Case closed, everyone assumed. Except one investigator broke ranks. Newton Winchell, the state's leading geologist, looked not at the words, but at the stone itself, and argued that the weathering inside the carved grooves looked far too advanced for something cut in 1898. He estimated centuries, not decades. It was a strange, lonely dissent, buried in an otherwise unanimous report, and it planted a seed that would not die. But there's a detail about Winchell's own report that rarely makes it into the retellings. Before he ever picked up a measuring tool, he wrote down his gut reaction to the carving. It looked fresh, recent, almost too clean. He talked himself out of that instinct once he started measuring weathering depth, and published his conclusion the other way. He never fully explained what changed his mind. The man who ended up defending the stone's authenticity had, on paper, seen it the same way everyone else did, right up until he decided not to trust what he saw. That seed didn't grow again for almost 100 years. Then, in the 2000s, a forensic geologist named Scott Walter picked the stone back up, literally, under a microscope. Walter studied a mineral called biotite mica, which breaks down and sheds from stone surfaces at a measurable rate over time. He compared the mica loss on the runestone's carved grooves to mica loss on tombstones in Maine, stones with known ages stretching back roughly 200 years. His finding? The mica on those 200-year-old tombstones was only beginning to flake away. The mica on the runestone's carvings was already completely gone. By his calculation, that meant the runestone had been weathering for centuries, not since 1898. If Wolter was right, an object dismissed by linguists as an obvious fake was geologically exactly what its date claimed it to be. For a moment, the impossible looked plausible again, and it spread fast. A cable television series built entirely around Wolter's investigations aired for years, introducing millions of viewers to the runestone as settled science, long before any peer reviewer had checked his numbers. Around the same time, a Texas-based researcher named Richard Nielsen, not a trained linguist, but an engineer who had studied the inscription for decades, pushed the theory further, arguing that a specific rune marked with an unusual dot matched forms found on genuine medieval stones from the island of Gotland. If true, it would mean the modern language wasn't modern at all. It had just been misread. That argument found its way to someone who could actually test it. Henrik Williams, a professor of runology at Uppsala University in Sweden, one of the very few academics anywhere with the credentials to settle this, took the dotted runes seriously enough to examine the stone in person in Stockholm, and spent years corresponding with Nielsen and Wolter about it. This wasn't a dismissal, this was a real scholar giving a fringe theory a genuine chance to survive contact with expertise. It didn't survive. Williams eventually concluded, in his own published analysis, that he could not find another medieval Scandinavian text that looked anything like the Kensington inscription. The grammar, the missing case endings, the vocabulary, all of it pointed the same direction it always had. But the theory had been taken seriously by exactly the kind of person who could have proven it right. That mattered. It meant the case against the stone wasn't built on academic snobbery. It was built on someone actually trying and failing to make the impossible version true. Then came the rebuttal that finished the geology argument for good, and it came from inside the same field. Geologist Harold Edwards, who had once worked alongside Wolter, published a peer-reviewed breakdown that took the MICA argument apart piece by piece. First problem, the runestone isn't even made of local rock. The glacial till around Kensington doesn't produce this kind of graywacke. The slab looks like imported stone, the type quarried commercially in the eastern United States in the 1800s. Second problem, measure the runes themselves, and they land almost exactly on the United States inch, a unit standardized in 1866, not a medieval Scandinavian measurement at all. And the third problem was the most damning. Some of the runes were carved into a thin layer of soft calcite coating the stone. Calcite weathers fast, faster than the surrounding rock. If those runes had been sitting exposed or buried for over 500 years, that calcite layer should show heavy erosion. It didn't. The letters, in Edwards' own analysis, looked almost as sharp as the day they were cut. A separate geologist, Michael Miklovich, raised another problem with the original tombstone comparison. It leaned on a handful of samples from a completely different region, with different minerals, different climate, different exposure. Not the kind of match you'd want if you were trying to prove something this extraordinary. The reversal collapsed, and it wasn't the only time a medieval Minnesota runestone fell apart under scrutiny. In 2001, a second inscribed boulder turned up near the original discovery site, seemingly corroborating it, until it came out that university graduate students had carved it themselves years earlier as a private joke and never expected anyone to take it seriously. Wolter had examined that one too, before the prank was exposed. The parallel is hard to ignore. Even in the modern era, with modern tools, experts can be fooled by a rock and a chisel. But the runestone's real undoing wasn't a joke. It came from an old notebook. In the early 2000s, researchers connected the runestone's unusual non-standard runic alphabet to a document called the Larson Papers, a notebook kept by a Swedish tailor in the 1880s, listing rune forms that matched the Kensington inscription almost letter for letter. Later research traced that notebook's origin to a parish region with a direct family connection to Olaf Oman himself, a cousin, living in the same small district where those exact runes had already turned up on other inscriptions decades before Oman ever set foot in Minnesota. Not a myth, not a rumor. A real, dated, physical document tying the exact alphabet on the medieval Minnesota stone to a village in Sweden, decades after Oman had already left for America, and generations after any Viking could have carved it. That should have been the final nail, and for most professional runologists today, it effectively is. But notice what this discovery actually did to the story. It didn't just prove a hoax, it proved a specific, traceable, almost forensic hoax, one connected not to some anonymous prankster, but to Oman's own community, his own family network, his own cultural inheritance. The impossible language wasn't impossible at all. It had just been hiding in the wrong century, in a small Swedish notebook nobody thought to check for over 100 years. There is one more piece of testimony worth mentioning, precisely because it's so weak. In 1976, a recorded interview surfaced in which a man named Frank Walter Gran claimed his father had confessed, decades earlier, to helping Oman carve the stone, a deathbed admission passed down secondhand, never notarized, never independently corroborated. Historians treat it as folklore, not evidence. It's mentioned here only because people still bring it up as if it settles things. It doesn't. The real case against the stone was never built on a confession. It was built on grammar, geology, and a notebook from a Swedish village, physical, checkable, and far harder to walk back than a story about what somebody's father supposedly said. Meanwhile, real Norse exploration of North America was quietly being confirmed by entirely different evidence, thousands of miles away. Archaeologists Helge Ingstad and Anne Stein Ingstad had already identified a genuine Norse settlement at Lance O Meadows in Newfoundland back in 1960, the first hard proof anywhere on the continent that the sagas describing a place called Vinland weren't pure fiction. Then, in 2021, a new team pushed the dating further, using a technique built around a solar radiation spike in the year 993 to date woodcut, with metal tools at that same site to the exact year 1021, precise, peer-reviewed, published in Nature. Butternuts found at the same site hint that Norse travelers pushed even farther south than the settlement itself, evidence for once that doesn't need a courtroom to hold up. Vikings really were here, 340 years before the Kensington date and roughly 1,500 miles away from Minnesota. Real evidence of Norse presence in America exists, it just doesn't reach anywhere near Oman's farm. So where does that leave the runestone? Not innocent, but not simple either. Because here's what nobody likes to say out loud. Even now, a handful of credentialed researchers still argue for authenticity, still contest the geology, still call the rebuttals biased. Some point to old Norwegian royal letters from the 1350s, ordering an expedition to check on Norse colonists gone quiet in the north, real documents describing a real mission that may never have actually sailed. It's the kind of half-true historical thread that keeps a theory breathing long after the physical evidence has moved on. That doesn't prove the wildest version of the story, but it does explain why otherwise careful people keep circling back to it. The stone's own museum in Alexandria still displays it as the centerpiece of the town's identity, standing beneath a 60-plus foot Viking statue nicknamed Big Ol, who calls the town the birthplace of America. Minnesota's NFL team took its name from the same Scandinavian pride the stone helped fuel. A television series built an entire audience, retelling Wolter's theories, some tying the stone to the Knights Templar long after most academic runologists considered the case settled. The linguistics, the notebook, the imported stone, those did the work no confession ever could. And still, the argument hasn't gone away. That's the part that should unsettle you more than any single test result. Not that a Minnesota farmer might have fooled the world for a season in 1899, but that 130 years of geology, linguistics, and archival research still haven't been enough to fully close the file. Not in the public imagination, not in the gift shops, not on the television specials still airing decades after the peer review came in. For thousands of Scandinavian American families across the upper Midwest, the stone was never really about a rock. It was about proof that their ancestors got here first, that the history books had simply left them out. That kind of hope doesn't fold just because a geologist finds a flaw in the mica. Ask who actually benefits from either answer, and the story gets more uncomfortable, not less. A small museum built its entire identity and its tourism around this one artifact. A community built a piece of its pride on it, and an entire academic field would have had to admit in 1910 that a farmer with no formal training had come close to fooling the best trained linguists in Scandinavia, an uncomfortable thought for institutions built on the assumption that expertise always wins. The stone is still there, behind the glass, in Alexandria, Minnesota. The label describes a discovery. It doesn't fully describe the argument still going on around it. Visitors lean in close, read the sharp, oddly modern-looking runes for themselves, and walk away believing whatever they walked in believing. Somewhere in that small museum, a rock that science says was carved by a 19th century farmer is still doing exactly what it was built to do, whether it was built by accident, by prank, or by a man who never got the chance to explain himself before he died. It is still making people wonder if Columbus was wrong.